Hello and welcome. My name is Alan Simpson. In this video, we're going to talk about creating a responsive NavBar with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Going to be working with three files. One's just a simple image called logo PNG, and that's just a generic make-believe logo. One's called hamburger.png, which is kind of a king-size hamburger menu for now. You can shrink it later. Then I have a page with a header in it. That appears across the top of the page in the browser and includes the logo image and the hamburger menu image. Then I have a nav bar with just a bunch of placeholders in it. These links don't go anywhere. I don't care about that right now. I'm just working on the styling and the responsiveness of it. Then I have one page and I have all the code in one page. And when I view that in a browser, you see the logo there on the left and the main title and the subtitle. On the right, the three bars are the hamburger menu icon, and the nav bars below that. Now, there's some CSS in there already to handle all this formatting, but that's not really what this video is about. Here, I want to focus on the responsiveness, where when it's narrow, we make this disappear, and they can click or tap that three-bar hamburger thing to bring it out of hiding. And on wide screens, we'll just make it visible all the time, and the hamburger menu won't need to be there. All right, so we're going to need some CSS and JavaScript. Here's the CSS I have so far. Pulling in a couple Google fonts. That's obviously optional. You can use any fonts you want. And then this header style rule is making the header fixed so that it doesn't scroll off the page. It gives it a height and a width. Header logo applies to that logo at the left. Have a little styling for the header, H1 and H2. And the hamburger menu, which is over on the right. Okay, just basic style for looks. And same thing with the nav, really. That is just a fixed position to the right side of the screen. Again, fixed just means it doesn't scroll with stuff. Each nav A is a block, and then I have this nav hover. And again, all of that is just the basic appearance. Basically what's giving you this. We haven't put it in anything yet to make it responsive. We're just making it look like that. Now, in real life, I would have this split up more where all the header and the nav and footer are each in its own file, and externalize the JavaScript and CSS so that I can share all this content across multiple pages without repeating the code anywhere. And then if I want to change something, I can just change it in the header, nav, or footer folder. But in this course, I don't want it to be complicated. I'm just going to put it all on one page so that you can download that page and mess around with the code. Okay, so the first thing we have to do to make this responsive is come up with a set of styles for wide screens and a set of styles for skinny screens, and that goes right in the style sheet. I'm going to put it at the bottom of this style sheet, right under the rest of the nav stuff. Okay, and then for wide screens, we'll say at media. Okay, I mean, when I say at, I mean the at sign. Screen, as opposed to paper, then and then inside parens we'll put min-width : 500px. So in other words, these styles in this section will apply when the browser window is at least 500 pixels wide. We need a pair of curly braces to put the style rules in that apply to these wider screens. On these, I'm going to say the hamburger menu, pound hamburger, displayed none. In other words, don't show it at all, because we're not going to make them click. The nav bar will display as a block, so it's always visible. So in other words, whenever they're on a wide screen, the nav bar is always visible. There's no need to click the hamburger menu, so we just hide that. Now, the 500 pixels is a little bit arbitrary, but I'm just trying to keep it simple here. You could have a dozen breakpoints if you wanted, but we're just going to have wide and skinny, and 500 pixels will be our cutoff. Okay, so remember that hamburger is the little hamburger picture, and nav is the whole nav. So if we go look at the page in the browser now with the browser window wide, the hamburger menu is gone, no more three-line thing, and the nav bar is there. And that's how we're going to keep it on white screens. They're not going to show and hide the nav bar there because there's plenty of room. Now, what about skinnier screens? Well, let's copy that at media thing we just did and paste it in again. So there's two of them. But on this one, we'll change it to max width of 499 pixels. So in other words, if it's 499 pixels or less, then we'll call it a narrow screen. That's just a comment, of course. And on those, we'll say the hamburger menu is display block. So in other words, it's visible. And then the nav bar itself will be display none, so it's hidden. Okay, so in narrow screens, initially we're going to see the thing they can tap to make the nav bar visible, but the nav bar itself won't be visible till they tap. Now I should mention that the reason you don't see me saving my work here is because I'm using VS Code with autosave turned on, so I don't have to save. If you were following along with some other editor, you'd have to remember to save your work before viewing in the browser. But let's go take a look in the browser now. So when the window is wide, we don't get the hamburger menu. We do get the nav bar. As we narrow it down, now the nav bar disappears and the hamburger appears. Nothing happens when I click the hamburger menu because we haven't written any code for that yet. So obviously we're not done, but we've made progress. Now I'm thinking that when I click that hamburger menu, I don't want the menu to disappear. I'd like to kind of slide in and out. So I'm probably going to have to think about that now. If we go up to the style rule for the nav, we see it's position fixed right 0. That tells me when it's visible on the screen, it's fixed, meaning that it won't scroll up and down with the rest of the content. And right 0 tells me that the right side of that nav bar is at the right side of the screen. In other words, the right side of the nav bar is flush right with the right side of the screen, so the whole nav bar is on the right side of the screen. If I wanted to slide in and out, I can't just say it's either visible with display block or not visible with display none. I have to be able to move it. Now if I go back to the original style rule where I defined what nav is doing here, I say its right edge is at 0. Okay, so when it's visible, its right edge is at 0. So then down in my at media rule for widescreens, instead of saying display block, I can say right is 0, but the right side is 0 because that also makes it visible. All right, so instead of display block, it's right 0. But what about when it's a narrow screen? Well, if we say right colon and then something like, let's try minus 100 px. You might say, what the heck does that do? Well, let me show you. Go back into the browser and refresh. Now, when the screen is wide, the right is 0, so it's all showing. When I narrow it, whoa, half of it is missing. Why? Because I moved it to the right 100 pixels, so half of it is off the screen and invisible, which means if I move it all the way to the right, it'll be completely invisible. Well, it turns out this thing is 210 pixels wide, and you can see that by looking at its width as defined in the style rule for the nav bar. So that means if I set the right side to minus 210 pixels, that is, I'm going to move the right edge another 210 pixels to the right, then the whole thing will be off the screen, so it'll be invisible as it was before, except now I can make it slide in and out by changing that right position. I don't have to rely strictly on having it appear and disappear. We're not there yet, but we're closer than we were before. So let's go take a look in the browser. And now on the narrow screen, it's completely invisible like we want. And on the wider screen, it's completely visible like we want. It's not sliding yet because we haven't gotten that far yet, but we're closer to that goal. In order to make it slide in and out, I'm going to have to apply and remove style rules. So let's go create those style rules first. One will be pound nav, for remember that's ID equal nav. So we'll say, we'll make one style class called pound nav dot hidden, and hidden's just a name I made up. I know it's also a word in CSS, but in this context it's just a class name. I could have called it goober or whatever, but hidden's easier. So nav dot hidden, and when we apply that, we'll say that the right side is at minus 210 px because we know that makes it invisible. And then the opposite of that, pound nav.visible, and again, visible is just a class name here. I just picked it because it's obvious. We'll make the right side 0, and then it's visible. So now we have two class names we can apply. Now those style rules aren't doing anything right now because I haven't applied them to anything. But what we can do is when the user can see that hamburger icon thing and click it, if the navbar is hidden, we'll make it visible by applying the visible class. And if it's already visible, we'll make it hidden by applying the hidden class. Anytime you want the browser to do something in response to a click or a tap, that's a good time to use JavaScript, and that's what we'll do here. First, up in the head section, above the closing /head tag, we need a pair of script tags to indicate that we're going to have JavaScript code in here. I'm going to start with window on load equal function, open paren, closing paren, and a pair of curly braces. And that just says, don't do anything with this code in these curly braces until the whole page has been rendered. In other words, until everything is visible on the screen. And that's needed because JavaScript interacts with a thing called the DOM, the document object model, which is a representation of the page in memory. But that DOM doesn't exist until the page is actually visible in the browser window. So window on load just makes sure everything is there before the JavaScript code starts doing stuff with it. As an alternative to window on load, you can put the JavaScript code down near the bottom of the page, like under the body tag or something. But typically you end up externalizing it anyway, so it's in the long run easier to just use window on load, I think. So the first thing I want to do in here is tell it, on that hamburger menu thing, add an event listener that listens for somebody clicking on or tapping that hamburger menu, so I can detect when a human has tapped that thing or clicked that thing. And the way I say that in JavaScript is document.getElement by ID hamburger. In other words, find the element with an ID of hamburger. Add event listener, which means you're going to listen for events on that. Click is what you're listening for, which is also a tap on a touch screen. And then function says, when that happens, do the code that follows in these curly braces. To test that it's going to work, I'll do something trivial in there, like say alert howdy, which means that it'll just throw up a message that says howdy. All right, and this is just a test. So when I go into the browser now and look at that page, reload the page, skinny it up so I can see the hamburger menu. When I click that, it says howdy. So that tells me my event listener is listening, and now I can tell it what I really want it to do inside that block, inside those curly braces. Instead of saying howdy, I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to store in that variable whatever class name happens to be applied to the navbar at the moment. Okay, so class applied is just a name I made up. Document.getElement by ID nav is a reference to the navbar. And I'm going to put on that .class name, and that'll tell me what CSS class name, if any, is currently applied to that nav item. And I can use an alert to check that out. When I go to the browser and refresh and click the hamburger, I get nothing. And that's correct because truly there is no class name applied to that yet. When the page first loads, the width of the browser window determines whether or not the hamburger thing is visible, but that's handled just with code in the style sheet. We don't have to use the style classes yet for that. Okay, back to our code. We don't need to alert class applied. That was just a test. What we really mean is if class applied equals two equal signs, quote, 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 nothing, if there's no class applied, then we'll, and that's a curly brace after that, and then we'll say document.getElement by id.nav.class name equal visible. In other words, we're going to stick that visible style class onto the nav. So if we go into the browser and refresh and everything and click, it goes from being invisible to visible. Now when I click on that some more, it does nothing because we haven't done anything else. But we can come down here and say else, if it wasn't nothing, then it was something, so make it hidden. Okay, let's see what that does. We have to go back into the browser and reload the page. I'm trying to jump the gun there. All right, click it, hidden. Click it again, it goes invisible. But subsequent clicks aren't doing anything. And that's because I haven't quite thought it all the way through yet. The first time I clicked it, it set the style class to visible, and I don't have an if condition for that. I say if class applied is nothing, then make it visible. But I don't tell it what to do if the class applied is the name visible. Now, I'm sure you guys who do this stuff all the time have already figured out an easy solution to this, but let's just step through it for the learners. And speaking of learners, remember JavaScript is case sensitive, so if you get one uppercase or lowercase letter wrong in your code, it won't work. But what we need to do now here in our code is say if classified equal nothing, or, which is 2 pipe characters in JavaScript, the class name that's currently applied is hidden, then it must be hidden because it's either no class is applied or a hidden class is applied, then it must be hidden, so make it visible. And we can test that real quick here. Open the browser, refresh, so on, off. It works perfectly. Now, far be it for me to say, if it works, go ahead and mess around with it. But this is a little bit long-winded in a couple ways. And I just want to show this to you because you might notice it in other people's code. I could really here just say if class applied is visible, okay, so if the visible name is applied to it right now, then just set it to hidden. Otherwise, meaning otherwise it's either hidden or nothing, set it to visible. So I just knock down the amount of code a little bit by removing that or, and it still works exactly the same. Maybe just refresh it. Not a big deal, but it just reduced the amount of code a little. Now, in real life, a lot of developers would handle something like this with a ternary operator, which is kind of 3 operators. An equal sign for assignment, a question mark, and a colon. And the way it works is you're going to assign a value to something. So we'll say we're going to assign a value to the class name on the nav div. Then you follow the equal sign with something that can be either true or false. Can't be anything else. It has to be one or the other. So our test could be document.getElement by ID nav.className equal visible. In other words, does it equal visible right now? The question mark precedes what you do if it's true. So if it equals visible, then we'll assign the name hidden to it. Then you put a colon, and that starts the else. If it doesn't equal visible, then we'll assign the name visible to it. And so that one big long line of code replaces all these multiple lines of code. And that's one of the reasons a lot of developers like to use it. It does reduce the amount of code. But when you're a learner, it does really pack a lot of logic into one line, which can be more intimidating until you're used to it. Anyway, let's test it and see if it actually still works. All right, so pop it up in the browser, reload the page, click a few times, and it works exactly as before. So basically, we're just doing the same thing we did before, but with less code. Now, earlier I said we're going to have this menu slide in and out. We haven't done anything about that yet, but that's a really easy thing to do, and we can do it in CSS. By the way, the reason you're not seeing a bunch of CSS in here right now is that I am using VS Code, and I have that whole internal style sheet folded or collapsed. You can tell because there's a plus sign next to the word style and 3 dots after the word style, and that's telling me that there's a whole bunch of code in between here, but right now it's folded. We call it code folding or hidden from view. And I did that just to get it out of my way so I don't have to scroll up and down through it all the time. But now I need it, so I'll click the plus sign. That'll unfold it. Now I can see that whole internal style sheet again. Now I need to get to those two style rules that we apply with JavaScript, and in each of them I'm going to put transition : 1s. 1s is short for 1 second. And what that says is that whenever we transition from one of these to the other, drag it out for a second. So when I refresh a page in the browser and click, now it slides in and out. It takes a second in both directions. All right, now if that's a little too slow for you, you can use milliseconds. I could say 500 ms. A millisecond's 1/1000th of a second, so 500 milliseconds is half a second. And refresh, of course, and then you can see it's faster. And, there's no right speed or wrong speed. Feel free to do whatever speed you like. Even 250 milliseconds wouldn't be unusual. It's only a quarter of a second, but it's still enough that you get the animation effect. So that's it for NavBar, for responsive NavBar. It's really just a few lines of code. You don't have to drag around any big libraries or anything. So it's, a clean, simple, low-maintenance solution in that regard. And with that, I'll say thanks for watching. I hope this video served you well, and I hope to see you around the net. All right, bye-bye now.